I myself have been a vegetarian for more than half of my life, and Simon will show us, or will show you as maybe passionate carnivores, how you can combine eating meat with a good conscience. And I think he will tell us how this project might even challenge us to rethink some boundaries ethically in a different way. So let's give it a heads up to Simon with MeatTech and the printed steak.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I think what I'll do is it's certainly about food without compromise, but also with a good conscience. And if you'll bear with me just one moment, I'll pull things up on screen and I'll be able to draw back the curtain on something that I'm very passionate about. And I think it'll be easy for others to be passionate about as well. So welcome to MeatTech. And as you just obviously is very exciting for vegetarians, but actually at MeatTech we hope it'll be at least as exciting for everybody else as well. And that's because we're lucky enough to live in an era, all of us are, where there's some really fundamental changes happening in agriculture in general, and more recently in the meat industry or the protein industry in particular. And at MeatTech, we're dedicated to really playing a leading role in the protein revolution and in hopefully rewiring essentially how certainly meat agriculture can be done. And it's through technology and obviously through biotechnology as well. We're all familiar with the conventional way of making meat. It's nothing new. It has some tremendous, outputs in the form of delicious meat products that many people enjoy eating. But I think it's fair to say that many people also prefer not to think about where those delicious meats have come from quite often. And even if the ethical issue is something that isn't a primary concern, there are other sustainability problems with how meat is produced today. And in the middle, of the slide, you'll see the cow and the chicken, for example. And they're very large consumers of land. They're very large consumers of water. They're very large consumers of various habitats that would better be protected. And the emissions that they produce, and this is mostly what comes out of the back end of the cows, is actually as large of a environmental threat as the emissions from the transport industry, including all the planes and the trains and the ships. So when it comes to meat, there are several sustainability issues, some of them environmental, some of them perhaps ethical. And I don't think anybody would have imagined that this is something that's going to be changed anytime soon. And those people, I hope to be able to prove wrong before too long. This is a forecast that perhaps helps people to imagine a different future for the meat industry. And you see here, the sort of projections for analysts looking at the future of meat, or some would call it alternative protein. And probably most of you have recently gone into the supermarket and started to notice that there are lots of plant-based proteins, things like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, and many other brands as well. And I think they've really sparked people's imaginations around how can I get that delicious meat experience without the compromise on taste or flavor or mouthfeel. And whilst those plant-based products can go some way, and quite a long way, in replicating the meat experience that people are looking for, there's perhaps an even better way just around the corner. And this means that, as nice as it is that vegetarians are excited about this, the real mission is to get the meat eaters excited about this as well. And you see here there's conventional meat, there's plant-based meat, and then there's this thing called cultivated meat. There are other names for this sort of technology. Some call it cultured meat, some call it clean meat, some call it lab meat, but they're all one and the same thing. And they're basically focused on doing something critical, something central very differently. And that is essentially changing the way manufacturing is done. And it really is a question of manufacturing, because here the cow and the chicken are gone. they're not in the center of this industry anymore, but they're replaced by what are called bioreactors, which are essentially a way of creating the same biological conditions that the cells in the bodies of animals, or in fact even in human bodies, have to be happy and successful and grow. And so what we're doing at MeTech is we're collecting stem cells, and they need to be fed, and they need to be given oxygen, and they need to be kept at a temperature that is like the temperature of a mammalian body, so 36, 37 degrees. And if you can recreate those conditions, the cells are perfectly happy to grow and multiply. And because they're stem cells, in our case, those can be turned into different types of cells. So a stem cell can be, if you know how to control the biology, can be convinced to express themselves or to differentiate themselves into muscle cells or into fat cells. And already here, you should be thinking about how. This is actually a really exciting prospect because this is a much more sustainable, much cleaner, potentially much healthier approach to how to make meat. It's also manufacturing just the things that we want, the muscle and the fat. This is what is so exciting about the flavors that we get from being carnivores. So the question is, what can one do? How does one turn this into the most premium, the most exciting product out there? How does one convince that person who's a real meat fanatic to essentially change their consumption behaviors without compromise and without a bad conscience? And these are the kinds of numbers that cultured meat can offer from a sustainability, from an environmental perspective. And you see this like for like, side by side comparison between conventional meat on top and cultivated meat made in these controlled conditions down below. And so there's significantly less water use, there's significantly less emissions, enormous reduction in the amount of land that's needed. And this is very exciting from the perspective of, obviously the environment. It's also very exciting from the perspective of where can you make meat? Today, meat is made in specific locations. Argentina is a big player, Brazil is a big player, and various countries have natural resources that are well suited to producing meat. But actually, when one's making meat in a cultivated process using these kinds of technologies, it doesn't really matter where you are. Anybody can become, or any country can become, a producer and a manufacturer of meat. And this is something that means that you can produce more locally. There's less shipping. Maybe the food can be even fresher. But it certainly changes the dynamic of how meat is produced. And this is an overview of what the real process looks like. And it starts by taking a cell sample. And this doesn't have to be done very often. Actually, on the chicken cells that we're sampling, we don't really need to go back to take any more samples from the chickens at all. Those cells are essentially, eternally alive, one could say. And so they don't actually need to be resampled. We can continuously grow those cells in the bioreactors, and we can then continuously turn them into either fat or muscle. And then they can be turned directly into end products, ingredients like meatballs or hamburgers, unstructured, the sort of typical processed meat products that are very common today. And that's one way of using those cells. The second approach, and this is a real focus, and obviously where the 3D printing comes in. 3D printing is magical in that it can create a huge amount of flexibility in product. It allows for customization. It allows for repeatability. And so we're taking those cells, turning them into bioinks. So you can imagine one ink that is a fat ink and one ink that is a muscle ink, and essentially allowing the printer to combine those different materials to create different structures. And maybe some of us have very different preferences when it comes to the type of steak that we'd like to eat. Some people like it marbled with the high fat content. Some people are perhaps watching their calories and they'd rather have it with a lower fat content. Again, these are just instructions for the printer of where to print those cells, which are living cells, and those bioinks contain living cells. But once they're printed, they need to be given a little bit of time to incubate. But at the end of it, the cells structure themselves, create a steak or a tissue-like structure, which means that one can actually envision a process that starts from a small cell sample and ends up with a steak that contains all of the mouthfeel and flavors that you'd expect from a traditional cut of meat, but there hasn't really been an animal in that production process at all. And this is really the vision for what we believe will become, a different way of producing, a different way of eating, and is as much, much more efficient, less food waste approach to producing food. And what we've hoped to be able to deliver with this sort of 3D printing approach is the ability to customize food for seasons or regions or cultural preferences in a way that allows for a real abundance of protein. And part of this is because of the growth of the world's population, we need to be producing more protein full stop. And traditional manufacturing processes are not going to be able to feed the planet in a sustainable way.
Well, it all sounds very futuristic, and there are cells, incubators, a lot of technical terms quite foreign to the meat making process. But I can see, and you explained very well, what the potential for sustainable development lies in this innovation that you have on your hand there. I was just wondering because let's dig a bit deeper into the whole sustainability. And I think when we talk about consumption and 3D printing, a lot of times people are saying, well, there might be the potential of having a rebound effect because people think, okay, now I can print my steak, so I can eat even more. And I think it's all about this behavior change. So, how do you feel, or how do you think about this behavior for the consumers, and how do you position yourself with meat tech in this regard, telling people, okay, it's not always about more and more and bigger and more meat. How do you think about that at meat tech?
Yeah, so on the base level, our mission is to allow for demand to be met, and demand is growing regardless of trying to really change things. People want to eat meat as the world gets wealthier and wealthier. More and more people are joining the protein bandwagon, and you see as countries get richer, they start to eat more protein. And so I think the real mission here is to find ways of delivering that protein that are more sustainable. I think it's going to be quite a challenge to fundamentally um, get people to not eat protein. I think for nutrition reasons, it's a necessity, but it's really a question of where does that protein come from and what sort of sustainability profile does it have? And the closer you can replicate the cultures and the behaviors of today, the easier it's going to be to shift people's consumption from a conventional meat industry to perhaps a more sustainable one. And I think at this point, our mission is to produce, to develop technologies to produce meat that is really a no compromise alternative. And it doesn't, and this is why the opportunity here is really not, it's not intended for vegetarians or for vegans. Obviously, we hope that they will enjoy it as well. But the real opportunity here is to get the meat eaters of today to perhaps make a little reduction in how they eat meat. It doesn't even have to be a binary choice. If we can get a small proportion of today's meat eaters to eat a little bit more cultivated meat in the future, I think we'll find that over time these technologies will be able to supplement initially, and perhaps in the future even supplant the ways in which meat decisions are taken today. It might be quite similar to the world of electric vehicles. 20 years ago, nobody was particularly interested in electric vehicles because there were too many compromises. And cultured meat, I think, is a very similar prospect where we'll expect to see over time that it becomes something that is essentially a true and 100% replacement for the meat that people consume today. So I would certainly like to see a world in the future where walking into a supermarket, if you have to choose, you have maybe a conventional meat and you maybe have a cultured meat. In the same way, today we have to choose between a diesel engine and an electric vehicle, and for many people that's an easy choice.
Okay, great. So maybe you talked about the potential of your product for giving a huge potential to sustainable development, but you have a company, so MeTech is a company. And how do you integrate sustainable decision making into your everyday life on a business level? Like, okay, you have a sustainable product, which is great, but how do you integrate the whole idea of sustainability into your company?
So MeTech certainly is a company. It's a publicly traded company. So obviously we have to be very transparent about the behaviors that we have. At MeTech, we're constantly working on our technologies and how we go about developing those technologies to essentially make the most sustainable choice uh, for the technologies we're developing. We're actually a business to business company. So the technologies we're developing are intended to be licensed and used by other companies. And we feel that if we can develop a process that we're then licensing, every point where we're developing our product, where we can introduce an awareness and take action in advancing sustainability, this will then be essentially replicated by our future customers who will be using processes that have green or sustainability built in.
Okay. So you think like the process and the product you're giving to the market is some sort of a role model for sustainable product making. But if I look, like you said, you're a company, can you tell us more about, apart from your core business, obviously, that is printing those stakes and other technology, what do you do for contributing to a sustainable development? I don't know, maybe do you have like some sort of electric car to move around Israel or Tel Aviv? How do you behave? Like, how do you put like the sustainable behavior within your employees?
So luckily, we're not an enormous global company. The company has about 40 staff between Israel and actually offices also in Belgium. And the activities are actually, I think we're lucky in that most of our staff are local. We're able to use obviously public transport as much as possible. We haven't got anybody with a Tesla yet, but we're certainly encouraging people to use hybrid vehicles to the extent possible. But I think our real focus is on ensuring that our products promote sustainability as a company, as a startup. Our material choices are, of course, hopefully selected as responsibly as possible. But we have to do in our labs what we have to do, and it's such a delicate task when one's developing, particularly biotechnology and so on, that our real focus is on leaving a legacy that allows for processes to be sustainable into the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Simon, for all the insights into meat tech and this futuristic idea of having a printed steak. Sounds still for me sounds futuristic, but I'm hoping that your idea and your product will get successful globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.